how many of you know the story of the prodigal son? How many of you knew it before Alex read it for us? How many of you have heard it 1,000 times before?
Pretty close.
Pretty close. Yeah. It is one of the two most popular parables that Jesus told. What do you think the other one is? I'll tell you. The Good Samaritan is the other most of the popular ones that Jesus told. And so a lot of people have heard the story of the prodigal son over and over and over again. But I bet you have not quite heard it told this way. Francis the Foolish felt a filial fondness for his flawless, fastidious father, Ferdinand IV. Following one February fortnight, Francis, feeling foolish and frisky, forced his fond father to fork over 545 farthings, then fled his father's fertile fields. Fleeing to foreign fields, Francis finally frittered away his fortune on fickle females, firkins of foaming ale, freeloading friends, and feasting. Fleeced by those fiendish fellows of the flesh pots, and facing fateful failure and famine, Francis finally found himself flinging foul feed to the swine in a filthy farmyard as a forlorn farmhand. Footsore and famished, he fain would have filled his flaccid frame with filched food, but found it fit only for a footman. Fee, flared Francis. My father's flunkies fare far finer. Fortunately, the frazzled fugitive finally faced the facts. Frustrated from failure and fulfilled foreboding, he fled forthwith to his faraway family. Falling fatigued at his father's feet, Francis feebly phrased his feelings. Father, he fumbled, I've flunked, and fruitlessly forfeited family favor. Forgive me. The far-sighted father, forestalling future family fissures, flagged his flunkies. Fetch a fatling from the flock and fix a feast for Francis forthwith. Fall to! Faster! Frederick, the feculent, Francis's feisty, fault-finding brother, frowned on his father's forgiveness of Francis's former philandering. Flog the flounder, he fumed. But the faithful felt that Francis's former foibles should be freely forgiven. Filial fidelity is what fathers are for, Frederick, said Ferdinand with feelings flowing. Forsooth, the fugitive is found, so what forbids festivity? Fly the flags freely amid fifes, fiddles, and fanfare. Fling a feast, Francis, face... Okay, that's a whole sentence. Fling a feast. Francis, face flushed, forsworn frippery forevermore by forcing his frame into a friar's frock. That part's not in the original. I didn't see it in the Greek. Fine. It's amazing what fun folly can be found on the frontiers of the internet these days. However, I suspect if the point of the story is still missed by many people, no matter how the story is told, and in spite of the fact that they think that they know what this story is really all about. I bet you think that this whole story is about how forgiving God is. And if you return to Him, He will receive you back no matter what you have done. Perhaps. I bet you think that this story is about the fact that God in His love longs to have lost people found. Perhaps. The parable of the prodigal is best understood by reading it as one of three stories with a very similar point. And with each story, in Luke 15, Jesus turns the screws a little bit tighter. The stories are these. The story of the lost and found sheep in verses 3 through 7. And then the story of the lost and found coin which is in verses 8 through 10. And then the story of the lost and found son, which is verses 11 through 31. Jesus tells these stories in response to the whining and the sniveling of the religious leaders and the Pharisees. And in verses 1 through 2, they were complaining about Jesus' merrymaking with lost people. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Verse 2, this made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such despicable people, even eating with them. Now, all three of these stories, parables, have the same basic pattern. Something is lost, something is found, and there's a joyous celebration. However, the third story takes on this kind of unexpected twist or turn when the older brother shows up. The story itself is built on these kind of exaggerated caricatures. This parable is a first-century cartoon strip. Of the three primary characters in the story, two of them are absurdly unreal. Consider the younger son. A Jewish son would never, ever go ask his father for the inheritance. And if he did, the father would never give it to him because it was illegal to do that, and it was ill-mannered. A Jewish son would never launch out on his own, traveling great distances, abandoning the safety of the Jewish community and his family. That whole idea is contrary to the Jewish mindset of that time. They had a communal mindset. They didn't think you could do that kind of stuff. Now, he might engage in reckless living and partying, and he might well lose all of his money. That stuff happened quite often. But he would never take a job feeding pigs, right? No matter how hungry he was, pigs were not only unkosher, but it was a repulsive and a revolting idea akin to eating poop. Even in a distant place, a Jew could always go to the local Jewish community center, and the center would have been obligated to make sure that he got at least 18 meals a week, even during a famine. But this lad is so contrary that he'd rather wallow with the pigs than take his meal with fellow Jews. He was and had totally lost it. Jesus sketches this younger son in such a way that he is completely unsalvageable in the eyes of the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and who, of course, is the primary audience for the telling of the story, right? If you jump back to verses 1 and 2, they're the ones that he's talking to. And the father who sees the son returning at a distance, who had been out looking for his son to return, he runs out to greet him. And at that point, the audience is rolling on the floor laughing. Jewish men didn't run. They'd never heard of Forrest Gump. And only Greek athletes wore Nikes. Jewish men didn't run. Jewish men wore these heavy kind of skirt-like garments, which in order to run they would have to pull up, which would expose their naked legs, which was considered very risque and very undignified. I mean, modesty is cultural, but in that context, you didn't show your legs. And so you can imagine this risque, lumbering, grown man running down the pathway, holding up his robe, tripping all over himself, and then falling all over this worthless imbecile of a son who had come wandering home. I mean, the whole imagery in this thing is a big, outrageous joke. Jesus has the whole crowd in stitches at that point. They had to have been laughing. I remember the first summer that I worked as a camp counselor at Frontier Ranch, which at Mission Springs, which is our camp and conference center in Santa Cruz, California. And we did an updated version of this story as a skit. Chris Erlandson was a wild and reckless woman. Now, Chris was not at all that way in real life, and so it was even funnier as a kid. She was a very proper. And Larry Mylander, who was kind of wild and crazy, was the wayward son. And Larry would come riding onto the set on his imaginary motorcycle. And then after the whole telling of the story, he would come home and he would run and he would literally jump into the arms of the waiting father. And I can't remember who played the waiting father, but he must have been big. And I remember that this whole thing was incredibly silly and totally ridiculous. And the kids were laughing out of control the whole time. That was one of the best and most accurate portrayals of this parable that I've ever seen. For this was the same response that Jesus must have been generating with all of this ludicrous imagery that he was throwing out there at these people. The youngest son and the father are outrageously funny to the Jewish way of thinking. Enter then the oldest son. He is normal. He looks normal. He talks normal. And he responds normally. He is the one who sees himself as the victim. There's no silliness in him. There's no dumb activities. Just straight and to the point. And yet he ends up becoming the brunt of Jesus' joke with all these people. Indeed, it is really he, the oldest son, that this story is about. It is, of course, easy to see the source of the oldest son's reservation and consternation. What justice is there if the son who had squandered his life on sordid and reckless living gets a party, while the son who has been consistent and true the entire time gets diddly squat? What kind of a personal insult is it if the wayward son comes home and gets to wear the family ring? You know, the ring is has a family kind of crest or seal on it, and if they're sealing some documents with wax, that was the one they put on there, and you imprint the legal documents. You can imagine what kind of privileges went along with having the family ring on. It's like handing the family Visa card to the kid. While the older brother doesn't even get an allowance. And of course he's the older brother, who in ancient Jewish society is supposed to get all the perks, right? The older son gets at least 2/3 of the inheritance would belong to him, and all of the rights and privileges and the responsibilities of running the family and calling all the shots, that belonged to the older son. I mean, talk about a slap in his face. None of us, none of you would have stood for it. And it's easy to see why this older brother is so ticked about the whole episode. Or is it? Maybe the older brother was missing something, or maybe we're missing something. A few minutes ago I mentioned that the pattern that runs throughout these three parables in Luke 15 is something is lost, something is found, celebration. In all three of the parables, everyone is drawn into the celebration. The shepherd finds his sheep, calls his friends to come over, and they order out for pizza and beer. The woman who finds her coin also calls her friends together, and they have a party. They all go down and they get their nails done, and go. And in both of these parables, we're reminded that heaven rejoices when one lost sinner is found and returned. Then in the prodigal story, the father throws a party for his son, verse 24, so let the party begin. And everyone in all the stories is partying over the loss that has been found. Everyone except the older brother. Heaven celebrates. The father celebrates. The shepherd celebrates. The woman celebrates. But the oldest son has a hissy fit. Could it be that in spite of his genetic relationship with the father, in spite of his righteous-looking activity, that somehow he is not really his father's son? In modern day terms, we'd be saying, maybe we should do a DNA test. He's not really his father's son in at least the way that counts. And that he's really out of touch with his father's heart. And if such is the case, then it is really he, the older son, who is the lost son. Are you tracking with that? He is the one who's lost. It is the older brother that is missing out. It is the older brother that is squandering the grace of God through his failure to recognize it. The word prodigal itself means someone who is engaged in extreme, outrageous, extravagant, or wasteful behavior. And in a sense, all three characters in the parable are prodigals. The youngest son, obviously, he wasted his inheritance and was wasting his life. The father, he is extravagant, perhaps even wasteful in his love for the youngest son. You know, what if the son hadn't, it had all been wasted, to love him back? But the oldest son is the biggest prodigal in the story. For he is wasteful of the inherited generosity. He is wasteful in his neglect and in his presumption. The fact that he is unable to celebrate the finding of the lost reveals that he is squandering his father's generosity. Indeed, he thinks that he knows the father, but the fact is that he has been working his tail off all these years to prove himself to his father, and he's been so busy that he's been unavailable to receive and enjoy the father's generosity. Do you see what's happening here? Jesus is turning the screws tighter and tighter on the Pharisees and on the religious leaders and on all people who presume to be in with God and who presume so based on their tremendous efforts in looking religious and looking like they've got it all together. Except they're so mixed up in their thinking that they've got the criteria wrong. I used to think that the problem with the Pharisees and such older brother types was snobbishness. That they somehow thought themselves better than everyone else because they were more consistent in their religion. They knew that they had quiet times with God for 30 minutes every single morning, and they read through the entire Bible every single year. Good thing. They knew more Bible verses by heart, by memory, than anyone else on their block. They knew that they always drove at least 5 miles under the speed limit no matter where they went, just so that they couldn't possibly edge over the speed limit by mistake. They knew that they always spoke with theological precision when they talked about God. They used all the right words just so that, it wouldn't mess up. They were very disciplined. They knew, they know, and they took pride in their discipline of religious practice. Although I suspect that some of this has to do with the way that our personalities are wired. Some of us are more prone to discipline than others of us. Just kind of, we're naturally disciplined. And we could start naming names here. But I'm not really one of those kinds of people. I'm not very disciplined. But I've worked at my own problems. And I'm sure that there is some snobbishness that's involved here. But I do not any longer think that the snobbishness is the real root of the problem with the older brother, or the older brother types. I now think that it has more to do with how we are defining success, the criteria that we choose for success. Are we successful because we have accomplished or attained a certain level of spiritual discipline, kind of like the older brother had? Or are we successful because we've somehow allowed ourselves to tune into the heart of God? That we see how generous God is and how generous God wants to be. We see the sacrifice that He's made. As we, during the season of Lent, focus toward the cross and the upcoming events of Resurrection Sunday, we're reminded that it's not so much about how much we've sacrificed to keep the cause of God alive, but that what He has sacrificed to give us new life. As you define success in your life, ask not what you can do for your God, but what God has done for you. Ask not what you can do for your God, but what God has done for you. We've got to be willing to give up whatever we might claim on our own in order to more fully participate in the grace and the generosity of God, that which is unearned by us, but is given by God. You see, once we figure out that our status is not defined by our success, but by God's generosity, then, and only then, are we free to join in the party for found people. At the beginning of the story, everyone was laughing at these cartoonish characters. The silly son, the outrageous father. But by the end it becomes apparent that Jesus is telling the story on the religious people. The people who couldn't bring themselves to laugh. They become the brunt of the joke. So the questions are these. Where are you in the story? Which kind of prodigal are you? Everyone's a prodigal of some sort. Which kind of prodigal are you? What kind do you want to be? And what is keeping you from laughing with joy? The story of the prodigals is really an invitation to let loose and an invitation to join in the celebration, to get down and to party, to break free, to enjoy the fact that God is in the business of finding that which is lost, and He does so just because He is by nature generous in His love. God wants to throw a party, and that's the good news.